So, hello and welcome to Max Bootcamp number 3. This is the third lesson in our series of introductions to the essentials of using 3D Studio Max for games production. These are lessons that are created for the first year students on the GameArt degree at Montfort University. And we're going to look at mapping using the UVW Unwrap modifier today. If you'll recall, in lesson 1 we had a look at the Max interface, where the menus sat, how to navigate the viewport. In lesson 2 we looked at the basic operations for polygon modelling, and now in lesson 3 we're going to have a quick look at one of the essential skills for game production, which is applying a map to a model that you've made to give surface interest and detail. So if I highlight this viewport, the perspective one, hit Alt and W, I can maximise the viewport, as you'll remember from the first lesson. And here we have a game model of a pickup truck. This is something that you'll be building probably next term. So it's a good looking model, solid, good volumes. If I hit F4 and bring up the wireframes on this, you'll see that the geometry's doing what you'd expect. Quite a lot of geometry is spent in areas where we need it to give roundness to the wheels, and then any place where geometry can be optimized. So for example, on this flat back panel on the boot of the pickup, or on the base in here, the geometry is kept very, very simple. So that's a good mesh, but obviously it needs more detail and complexity that will come from a map. And one of the essential parts of getting a map on is getting the mapping coordinates right, the UVW Unwrap or mapping. So what I want to do first is apply a test map so we can have a look at how the mapping works on this. So if I come up to rendering and then pick material editor, and I'll just go to the compact material editor for now. I'll bring that up, and I've got some pre-made materials here. One of them is this test grid, so I'm going to assign this test grid to the car. So if I drag in the scene, select all the geometry, highlight my test grid material, and then click this assign material to selection button, click that, and now we have the map displayed on the surface. What you can see is that this checkered pattern is clearly visible. It's not really distorted or warping. It's about the same size all over the surface. So we have good mapping. If you look closely, you'll see something else. You can see that the letters and numbers on the checkered pattern are reversed here. That means that the mapping runs one way on this side of the body and the opposite way on the other side of the body. And I'll show you the texture in a minute and why that's happening. So I've still got everything selected. I want to apply the full material, so if I click on the truck M material and click on the assign material selection button, there, now we see the material, the full material. Let me just hide the material editor. I'll hit F4 to hide the wires, and there we can see a much more convincing truck. Now we have the good volumes that the mesh gave us and the detail that the map is giving us. So in areas where there was a fair amount of geometry anyway, like the wheel, the texture really lifts detail that would be too fine to put into the geometry. And then in areas where there was very little geometry, deliberately because we wanted to keep the mesh light, like the back of the floor of the pickup or the boot here, the texture is giving a good deal of detail. So if you look at this, for example, this kind of beveled pattern here, that's not in the geometry. If I hit F4 and bring up the wires, you can see that it's not in the geometry at all. If I go into Photoshop and have a look at the texture, here's the texture that we have assigned. You can see that that's the texture that's kind of giving not just the surface colour and interest, but actually some modelling and form to the model as well. Tab back. That's what's making it convincing. That's why it'll look the part in a game. I mentioned that reversed mapping. The reason for that is, if you look, here's our side of the truck, and actually we've only got one of these pieces of the texture on the texture sheet, and that's because we use it facing this way on one side of the truck and the same part of the texture facing the other way on the other side of the truck. What I'm going to do is quickly show you what this texture looks like when it's laid out. I'll go to the Unwrap modifier. This is the thing that we'll be kind of doing properly in the tutorial later on. I'll open it up quickly. Don't worry about the complexity for now. We'll be dealing with this in lesson 4. But what you can see is that lots of these these mesh sections are broken up and split up and arranged like a jigsaw all over the texture that's laid out in the same way. And it's quite a complex process. It takes a little bit of getting your head round. You can see why you'd want to do it though, because the results are very, very convincing. So that's a brief introduction to why you need to learn how to lay out mapping and unwrap surfaces well to make a convincing games object. What we'll do for learning now is we'll look at some simpler objects and we'll step through the process quite slowly. What we'll be doing with these objects is we won't be looking to break up the surface into many parts. We'll just be mapping the object in one go, and we'll be concentrating on making good choices about the type of mapping that we fit and how we adjust it. So let's go to the main file that we're going to use. Here's a file that has a couple of simple quads in, and then a picture frame and a bottle, and we've got two versions of that. We have versions that are mapped correctly already and some versions without the mapping on. So let's highlight our perspective viewport, hit Alt-W again and bring it full screen. Because this is a mapping operation, generally we don't need to see multiple views of the object whilst we're working on mapping, so it's a good idea to just work in the perspective viewport and maximise the thing you're looking at. Let me bring up the material editor and show you the test materials we've got in place already. Remember, you can do that by rendering material editor and then pick the editor you want to use, which brings it up, or alternatively if you hit the keyboard shortcut M, that brings it up in one go, which is much quicker. Here you can see a mapped quad. If we click on a swatch in the material editor and drag, I can just pull different materials on. That's the same process as, remember, before I'd selected the object and then clicked on the Assign Material button. Either works. Clicking and dragging is sometimes faster. So you can see that we have this grey checkered texture on this quad. We have exactly the same texture. Let me just check. Yeah, we've got the same texture on this quad, but it's not displaying well. So let's look at the very simple operations on this. What I'll do is I'll go through this quite quickly, and then we'll do the process a little more slowly on the picture frame and the bottle. So let's minimize materials. Let's look at this quad. If I hit F4 so I can see the wires, yes, I'm certain that I've got that selected. What I need to do is I need to make some modifications to this mesh because it's not displaying mapping properly, and the modifications are to add the UVW Unwrap onto the surface. So that's a modifier. So if I go over to the command panel on the right, remember there are a series of tabs for creating, for modifying, hierarchy, etc. This is a modifying operation, so let's highlight the modifier tab, and we want to add a modifier from the modifier list. So if I click on that and scroll down to the bottom, there's the modifier I want. It's the Unwrap UVW. So if I click on that, you can see nothing much has changed in the viewport, but if you look in the modifier stack for our quad, it now has this Unwrap UVW modifier applied. We want to work UVs, you can manipulate them at a vertex level and an edge level and a polygon level. To apply them, you always have to work at a polygon level. So I need to make the polygon level in this Unwrap modifier active. So if I click and expand it, I can come down to the polygon level, and if I highlight that, I'll now be able to make some changes. So I've highlighted that. You can see that that's highlighted the polygons in there. If I hit F2, that shades polygons red or toggles the shading off. So at the point where I've hit the polygon level, it's selected the polygons. If I deselect things, I can always then just go in and click and drag and manually select those. So I've selected the polygons. I have the Unwrap modifier there, but things aren't looking terribly good, and that's because I need to make some modifications to the mapping choice and how it's applied. There's a lot of information in the UVW Unwrap modifier, so to get all that on screen to see it easily, it helps to have two columns in the command panel. So if I click on the left hand side of the command panel and drag, you can see I've got two columns, and that information's a little easier to see. So I have my quad. I'm going to select a mapping type, which I'll explain in a bit, and I'm going to choose a mapping direction, and there, Let me hit F2, toggle the shading off, and we have a quad that's perfectly mapped. Great, so let's go through that operation now on the objects that we're really interested in, which is this picture frame and the bottle. What we want to do is, let me come to the top of this, move over and select the picture frame. I want to just work on the picture frame and not be confused by anything else in this fairly busy scene. So if I right click in the viewport, I can go to isolate selection, and now I just see the picture frame on its own. That's actually not the one we want, because that's the one that's been mapped already. So if I right click in the viewport again and I end isolate, I get back into the scene. So let's now pick the one that's got no mapping on, right click, isolate selection, and now we're ready to work on it. So we have the object that we want to modify. We're in the modify panel, we have that. We're in the command panel, we have the modifier tab active. Let's go to our modifier list, scroll down to the bottom and find the Unwrap UVW modifier and apply it. So we can see it in the stack, but we don't see any effect of it on it yet. If you look over at this section of the modifier, there's a panel called projection. This is where we will be doing quite a lot of our work, and you can see at the moment I can't click on it. It's unresponsive and it's grayed out, and that's because I need to work at a polygon level to be able to use these tools. So let's expand the modifier, click on a polygon level, and you can see that these are now active. They've kind of lightened up, and you can also see in the scene that there is now a yellow square has appeared. That's the mapping gizmo that shows that some mapping is trying to be applied to some polygons. Let's just check that we have all the polygons in the object selected. So if I hit F2 again, you can see that we've got some polygons selected, but not enough. So I'll click and drag, select all the polygons. Now it means that any mapping operation we do would be applied to all of the polygons in the mesh. I'll hit F2 just to hide the shading, so we can see things clearly. Now, what I've got is the right map applied, and I can see that I have some mapping active here because I have the mapping gizmo, but the map looks terrible. What's happened is the modifier has done its first best guess for placing the gizmo, the mapping gizmo, and usually we need to adjust this. So mapping can seem quite an abstract operation, but the core part of it is that generally any part of the surface that you want to apply a map to, you want to look for a map projection that has the same kind of shape. The map projection is the way that you wrap your surface texture onto the mesh, and so if you have a flat object like this, you're probably going to want to use a planar mapping. If you have a cylindrical object like the bottle that we'll see in a minute, you probably want to use this cylindrical mapping. Also you have spherical mapping and box mapping, and those are good for, you know, spheres and boxes, as you'd expect. So before we use the planar mapping, let's just try the other projections to see the kind of results we get. So if I click on cylindrical mapping, you can see immediately that we get a different looking gizmo. Actually, this is a cylinder, but it's very, very squashed. It's squashed down to fit the volume of the picture frame. It's also not quite sat on the picture frame, so it's useful to come down, and if I click on this fit button, it will snap to wrap around the object. So I still have mapping, but it's not looking very good. Let's try the spherical map. Here you can see we now have a very, very squashed sphere. There's one equator, there's another kind of loop around it. I'll click fit again. Yeah, that's not giving us a good result. I'll try the box projection. Actually, the box projection at first looks like it's giving us a good result. We can certainly see the map nicely on the front of the picture frame. Actually though, if I come to the edge, the side edge of the picture frame, you can see that the box mapping tries to map the same texture in from each one of the 6 axes. So on the edge of the picture here, we've actually got the whole picture squashed in, which isn't what we want. So, as I said just now, for a flat shape you generally want to use planar projection. So let's try the planar projection. Click that on. Okay. That isn't as promising as you might have thought it would be. So what's the problem here? Well, you can see if we look at the gizmo that we've got a flat rectangular gizmo, and we have a flat shape, so hopefully that would work. However, you can see that the way it's lying is it, instead of being pushed flat against the front of the painting, it's come down from the top, so it's aligned on the Z axis. If we go over to the projection panel again, you can see not only do you choose the projection type, but you choose a direction to align it along. So this is aligned along Z. If I click and align it along X, you can see it flips direction, and still we don't have a terribly good result. If I click on Y, bam, there we go. It's aligned in the direction that we want it to be. It's pushing straight forward onto the surface, and we see the map clearly. So that's looking pretty good, but we still have some problems in that if we look closely at the picture, let me toggle the wires off, you can see that the picture in the texture is not fitting right up to the edge of the volume of the geometry that we need to fit it on. So once you've got a mapping applied like this and the gizmo active, what you can do is you can use your move, rotate and scale tools to make changes on the mapping to make it fit well. So if I have the move tool active, I can let me see, if I drag around the mapping, you can see that the geometry is staying in the same place, but the mapping slides through it, and so our texture map slides over the object. Control Z to undo that. I'll now try rotate. If I rotate, you can see again the geometry is staying still, but the mapping rotates across the object. Control Z to undo that. Scaling is quite interesting. If I click on scale now, if I scale up, it does kind of what you'd expect. The picture gets, we zoom into the picture. If I go the other way and scale down, what happens is the picture tiles more and more and more across the surface. Anyway, we've got the picture sort of at the right height and the right rotation, but the scale's a problem, and what we need to do is widen it out. So we're going to use the scale tool. For accuracy now, let's just do this in a front view because it will make it easier to line things up. So if I use the keyboard shortcut F, there we go to a front view. I have the scale tool active, and what I'm going to do is just click on the X-axis for it, because all I need to do here is just widen this slightly. Widen it a little bit. Actually, I need to do a tiny bit more. I think that's about the right width, but I need to nudge the picture over to the left. So let me go to the move tool and just slide it over. Yeah, there, that looks good. I'll hit P to go back to a perspective view and just quickly tumble that around. Yeah, the picture frame's looking alright. Good. So we have the picture mapped, and the operation we went through there is we selected the picture, went to unwrap, added the unwrap UVW modifier, went to the polygon level, made sure that we selected all of the polygons, then we used a planar mapping in the Y axis, and we did some adjustment to position and scale until the surface looked right. Cool, so let's go and have a look at the bottle now. If I right click again in the viewport, end isolate, and now we can see our what was an unmapped picture, which is now mapped, and next to it's the unmapped bottle. If I go to the top level on the picture, I can then move across and make a selection on another mesh object. So I'll select the bottle without mapping, right click, isolate selection, there we see it on its own. I'm just going to check I've got the right material assigned, so if I hit M, that's the shortcut for bringing up the material. Let's drag on. Yeah, we're seeing a change each time we do that, so let's make sure that we've got the bottle on. Pull that down. There's our bottle texture applied, material applied, but it's not looking good. Hide the material editor, and we now need to repeat the mapping process there. So it's exactly the same. We've got another mesh object to map. It's a modifier operation. We're in the modifier tab. We go to the modifier list, down to the bottom of it. Let's find our unwrap UVW modifier, apply it. We can immediately see something's happened. Let's go to the polygon level, hit F2 just to shade things, Actually, in this case already we've got all the polygons selected, which is great. So let's just bring up our projection. We've got our bottle with the unwrap modifier applied. We're at the polygon level. We know we have all the polygons selected. We have some mapping assigned, and now we're going to make changes to the mapping with the projection and align tools. So first of all, let's just try planar mapping. That's planar mapping from the top. That's not much use for us. Let's try it from another direction. Actually, that sort of works, but you can see that one side it reads, the other side it's flipped, and it's smearing on the side. So that's not quite right. Likely we're going to need cylindrical mapping. Quickly try spherical mapping. Yeah, that doesn't work. Box mapping. That doesn't work. In fact, here it's interesting. You can see the way the box splits up faces. So as anything that mostly faces in the direction of one of the sides of the box picks up a texture from that direction. That doesn't work well for us here. So let's choose the cylinder. Okay. So we've got cylindrical mapping, and very much like what happened with the picture frame, it's the right type of mapping, but it's come in with the wrong type of orientation. So you can see here's the gizmo, the cylindrical gizmo, and it's not wrapped around the bottle in the way we expect. If you look, that's the up and down axis, the one that we want to wrap our mapping around, the Z axis. So with the cylindrical mapping active, let's click on Align to Z. Yep, and there we go. Straight away we've got the bottle in the right place. We don't really need to scale or move this, but that's an option if you want. You could slide the gizmo up and down. You could rotate it, and you could use scale. Let's try and make those changes. Don't really need to do that, but there is something we do want to check, which is if we go to a front view, let me hit F again to bring up the front view. You can see that I have a label on the bottle, but it's not facing forward in the front viewport, and that's something that we want to do. So I need to rotate the mapping. Let me just hit F4 to bring up the wires, and then I'm going to go to the rotate tool that's working on just the mapping gizmo, and I'm going to, you can see I can spin that round, and you'll notice it's just the map that's rotating. The mesh is static, staying in the same place. Even though it does look like the bottle is spinning round, it's not, it's just the texture. So let's turn that around till we have the label facing forward. There we go, that's great. And go to the top level, hit F4 so we can see things. Yeah, our bottle looks pretty good. So let's bring everything back, right click, and isolate. Let's select our two objects and just look at those on their own. So isolate selection. Hit P for perspective view so we get the best look at them. There we have the correctly mapped picture frame and the correctly mapped bottle. Just going to do one last thing, a bit of housekeeping. I'll select the the picture, and collapse the stack because we're not going to do any more work at the moment. We can always put another modifier back on this, but for neatness it's best to collapse your stack at this point. Right click on the top, collapse all, click through this dialog, and now we just have a mesh object with the right mapping. I'll do the same on the bottle. So to recap, what we saw with the pickup truck is that we had a complex object with good modelling, and mapping was necessary. Applying mapping and then complexity with a complex texture was necessary to give detail in areas that we couldn't build in geometry, and also add surface colour and form. On the pickup truck we were mapping in quite a complex way where the texture was almost like a jigsaw, and we had to slide parts of the mesh, the mapping of the mesh, onto those jigsaw pieces. What we then did is that we learnt the basics by looking at two simple shapes that we mapped in one go, and what we learnt there is that we have to select the object, go to the modifier panel and add the Unwrap UVW modifier, make sure that we're in the polygon sub-object level for that modifier, apply the mapping, and once the mapping is applied we needed to go to the projection part of the modifier and choose the right shape for projection to fit the object. So in the case of our picture, we needed a planar projection because it's a planar looking object. In the case of our bottle, we needed a cylindrical projection because it's a cylindrical object. So we apply with the right projection, and then we usually have to do a bit of adjustment, which is making sure that we're aligned on the axis that works best for us, and then usually some modifying by move, rotate and scale until we get a good fit on the surface. So that's the very basics on using the Unwrap UVW modifier. What we'll be doing in lesson 4 is we'll be returning to use the Unwrap UVW modifier again, but we'll be doing something that's a little closer to the mapping that was used on the pickup truck. So we'll need to map different parts of the object and slide them around within the UVW editor, which we'll pick up in lesson 4. So thanks for your time on this, and I'll see you in lesson 4.